I am Dr. Mitch Harlan, and welcome to the Truth Talks podcast. This week's episode is intense. One of the hottest topics literally on the planet today, vaccinations. Our guest, Mr. Bigtree, the writer and producer of the movie Vaxxed and host of the HighWire, is here with us this week. Listen as he brings the research, the data, and the controversy of vaccinations directly to you. I'm Dr. Mitch Harlan, and welcome to the Truth Talks podcast. I'm here today with Bigtree. Del, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
Doing absolutely fantastic. I tell you what, I got to be honest with you. I didn't even sleep real well. This is like the hottest topic in the world right now. And I want to go through just a couple things. You're the writer and producer of the documentary Vaxxed, From Cover Up to Catastrophe. Obviously, you host the HighWire. You're a former Emmy-winning producer of The Doctors. And in my opinion, the leading authority in vaccination concerns. Does that sound pretty accurate?
I think that sounds, I'll accept that. Leading authority, there's a lot of great people out there, but I definitely say that I can stand with it, just about anyone when we're going to discuss vaccines.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt. So, one of the things I'm going to lead off with right here is the World Health Organization announced that vaccine hesitancy is one of the top 10 threats to global health. Have you heard that before?
Oh, yes.
And then so I'm gonna actually do kind of a little bit of a monologue here, and I want you to tear down everything that I say. If you agree, disagree, whatever it is, you just hammer me back as hard as you want, anything you want. But I'm going to actually kind of speak for the American people and concerned parents and maybe people all over the world, right? Different cultures have different ideas, but I'm going to tell you a quick story about me personally, and feel free to chime in whatever you need. But I have a stepson who has autism. Now, I do not believe that he was vaccine injured. He's 19 now. He came out autistic, no doubt about it. But I was going to have two more children. And one of the things that happens when you have an autistic child, especially for me being a doctor as well, I had that concern that vaccinating those children may predispose him, because I didn't know if the genetic code was from his father or from my wife, his mother. So is that a valid concern, do you believe?
Well, I think when we look at autism, first of all, a lot of people think that what I talk about is that vaccine is the only way you can cause autism. It's absolutely not my belief. So I can accept that children are born with autism. I think that in my studies of autism and talking to some of the top scientists that have been focused on this their entire careers, what you find out is that autism really is a genetic disposition or a genetic susceptibility to toxins. Or more specifically, an inability to, to clear toxins out of the body. And so, whereas one child can, be breathing in a broken fluorescent light bulb, and, we see kids on YouTube, like, hitting themselves with it, I've talked to parents who that's exactly where they lost their child. A fluorescent light bulb, one of them broke, the child, a school person swept it up, and then they must have breathed in the mercury in there, and then next thing they know, repetitive motion disorders and all sorts of things like that. And so, what I think, when we say it's genetic, there's in many ways too much focus on genes, in that's where the CDC and the World Health Organization, they all say that autism is genetic. I think that what we will find when everyone starts being a little bit more honest and doing the proper science is that there will be a genetic component, but that it's just a genetic susceptibility to toxins or environmental conditions, and not necessarily that you have a gene that makes you autistic. And so I think that it would be reasonable to be questioning, is there, and I meet a lot of parents that, I've interviewed thousands of parents, and many of them come up talking about something called the MTHFR gene mutation. Now, I haven't done a deep dive in that. All I know is thousands of parents are all talking about this gene mutation that deals with your methylation. That's your ability to detoxify a toxin. And many of these parents come up to me and say, yeah, we finally tested and found out both me and my husband are, MTHFR, we have the gene mutation. And so there's a belief that things like that, I'm not saying it's the only one, but will lead to a disposition or a susceptibility, I think. And that's probably the connection our genes will ultimately prove to have. So, I think about, is it your wife? Was it the father? There may be something there for sure.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that was certainly my topic. And so I went to my pediatrician, who, by the way, I really searched him out and wanted to make sure that he was the right kind of pediatrician for me. And so I took a bunch of documents that I had at the time, well before I knew anything about what you guys were doing, just stuff that I had learned on my own. And I take it to him, hundreds of articles, and he literally read through every single one of them. We extended the vaccination program. So I want to be clear to my listeners, to the Truth Talk listeners, that I did vaccinate. And we certainly did it on a very extended schedule, of which he completely agreed with me. As a matter of fact, to the point where we had many conversations, couple dinners, couple actually drinks at the bar, and we talked about this stuff. And it literally gave me the feeling that he wasn't 100% sure either. So that, I think, was really important to me. And sometimes, the conversation comes up, is the risk worth the benefit? Well, it is, unless you're the one that end up having the bad outcome. So I absolutely empathize with those parents.
Yeah, and I think that's really where the conversation needs to be. If anyone's going to have an intelligent conversation about vaccine risks, whether it's neurological disorders, which include autism, or autoimmune disorders, which include diabetes, multiple sclerosis, lupus, and childhood leukemia. All these things are just skyrocketing right now. When I have this conversation, I travel all over the country, and I talk to politicians a lot that are on the verge of maybe trying to remove a religious exemption or remove an exemption, so you have no ability to opt out of the vaccine program. And so what I usually start the conversation with a politician is I'll say to them, I want to ask you a question before we get started. Would you, write a law that mandates that anybody with an infection has to get penicillin? And they'll say, well, no. I said, okay, why? And every time so far, they're usually educated enough, they say the same thing. They say, well, because some people are allergic to penicillin and they could die, and I certainly wouldn't want to, force a product on somebody that can kill them. I said, okay, that's very interesting. And I agree with you, that's true. And then I'll say, so you do recognize, then, that there's never actually been a pharmaceutical product that someone's not allergic to. Whether it's a drug or a vaccine, it's a pharmaceutical product. And I'll say, in fact, let me take it one step further. We've never found a piece of food that everybody in a stadium could eat where someone's not going to have some sort of anaphylactic reaction and could potentially die. So the conversation I want to have today, I will say to them, is not if vaccines cause harm. The question is how much harm, how often, or how many deaths are you willing to accept when you say, it's the casualty, that's an accepted casualty. Because, and I'll say to the politician, because I assure you, you have a threshold. You may be fine with 1 in a million children getting a vaccine that dies, but would you be okay with 1 in 100,000? Or how about 1 in 10,000? Or 1 in 1,000? Or 1 in 500? Or 1 in 100? And I say the conversation we have to have is, what do we actually know about the data? And if you really would like to work with me today, we need our government agencies to start demanding that this data be collected, because the truth is, we don't know what the number is, and I think that that's dangerous. We can't just keep saying, oh, it's 1 in a million. That's just a generic statement. There are plenty of things. For instance, I'll just throw this out because I have a million facts. We might as well get some out of the way. We have VAERS. We have the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. This is the database where we collect the injuries that take place. If you go to your doctor and let's say you get vaccinated and then that night your arm stiffens up and then in the morning you got no feeling in your fingers, you might be having some sort of issue. If you tell your doctor's supposed to report that to VAERS immediately. It says right on every vaccine, any any potential reaction, doesn't even have to be causally related, should be reported to VAERS. So that great scientists can go through and comb through and see, do we see any sort of pattern of why somebody had a reaction? And certainly doctors will throw out a lot of it and say, well, that it clearly wasn't caused by the vaccine. But every piece of data is supposed to be collected. Well, VAERS, the system in the last year we have up to date is 2018. There's over 60,000 reported injuries in VAERS. There's 400 deaths reported in VAERS for 2018 alone. 400 people, you know, somebody wrote in and said, my child died or my patient died right after getting a vaccine. And so that's alarming enough. And then you're talking about, I think it's 5,000 to 10,000 emergency room visits, you know, thousands of permanent disabilities. All of these things are on this VAERS site. Now, the problem is that we could look at that and people say, well, Del, you know, they haven't combed through it yet. That's the raw number is, you know, 60,000 deaths or whatever it is. But in the end, what we have got to do is comb through it. I say, well, you have a bigger problem than that. Because they'll say it's not all going to be accurate, and I agree. But Harvard Medical School was hired by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to study VAERS. They said, we want to know how efficient VAERS is at capturing this important health risk data. And Harvard Medical School spent a year investigating it, using their own HMO platforms and things to study how are doctors reporting. And what they came back with is that VAERS appears to be capturing less than 1% of the total amount of injuries. If it's less than 1%, then you have to multiply all of those numbers by 100, meaning it's not 60,000 injuries, it's potentially 6 million injuries. In 1 year, 400 deaths turns into, you know, what is that, 40,000 deaths or something like that? I'm trying to do my math off the top of my head, but what we get is we have a serious problem, right? And so when a doctor wants to say, well, it's a rare event, the only data I can look at right now is VAERS. Now, and that's totally inaccurate. And by the way, we shouldn't be extrapolating, you know, 1%. You can't make mathematical or scientific decisions on 1%. In fact, that's probably what we've seen happen with the coronavirus, right? It's just so statistically inaccurate. It is insane. But why is our data collection so bad? You know, that's the problem. The VAERS systems have been in place since the 1980s. Why is nobody automated it, right? We are the home of Apple. We're the home of Microsoft. We could absolutely, with computer learning, we should be able to take every single data point, every reaction a child has, every reaction a person has, and have that system be fully online and collecting all of the autism, all of the, you know, all of the cases of whatever took place. But instead, we have one of the worst data collection systems in the world. And that, I think, is troubling. And guess what? When Harvard Medical School reported to the CDC what they had found, and by the way, we paid $1 million of taxpayer money to have Harvard investigate that VAERS system. Harvard said, look, it looks like we're only capturing 1%. And it says at the bottom of the study by Harvard, as soon as we gave the results to the CDC, they stopped returning our phone calls. They stopped returning our emails. We were supposed to, you know, under whatever circumstances, if we found a way to automate it, we were supposed to work with the CDC to automate it and upload it. Because that's what they'd done. They'd automated their own HMO system and said, look, this can work. We can do this around the entire nation. The CDC stopped the program immediately, never returned another phone call, which tells you CDC doesn't want to know the truth because they don't want to have to tell us the truth. And so instead, and this has been my 4 years of investigation, science is literally sticking its head in the sand so that it can keep saying to you, well, there's no studies that back that up. But the very people that are supposed to be doing the studies are avoiding the studies because they have a grave concern of what they might find. So,
and I mean, that is just incredibly reasonable to me. I always like to believe that I look at everything from a completely logical explanation. There is nothing you've just said that's not logical there. Right. Maybe we take on the other side of this coin, though, maybe we take a non-scientific approach with this. And one of the things that I look at is it only takes a simple Google search. Most people know someone that's had a vaccination injury. And I mean, it is something that is completely evident. So when somebody tells me that they're completely safe, man, it's hard for me not to shut off immediately, because I'm like, no, I'm not saying that the vaccination isn't a place in this world for it, because I think the science behind it makes some sense. Like, let's give a little bit of something to build up that immunity, maybe help us out. I can't argue with that science. I think there's probably some validity to that. But just as some of the other stuff you just went through about the testing, the safety and all that, I 100% don't believe it's there. And I'm going to go on record, and I'm going to say this because it's how I feel. And this is why we do this thing called Truth Talks, right? Do I think vaccinations cause autism? With 100% of my fiber, I believe that. I've seen too many people that have come out and have shown stuff that it took place the next day or 2 days later. Do I believe all of them? I don't. I don't believe all people get autism after vaccinations. But what concerns me is exactly what you just said. We don't freaking know the numbers. So then how do you make an informed decision on that?
Well, that's exactly it. And I challenged a CDC scientist up in Washington with that same conversation. I said to her, how do you sleep at night? I mean, I said, we can agree, right? I mean, I want to give her credit because she came to see me speak. So she was obviously trying to see where the other side was at. I was getting a lot of hype. And so she came up and we actually sat down for a while and talked. And I said, we can agree that there are injuries from vaccines. And she said, yes. And some children will die. She said, yes. And I said, well, then, how do you sleep at night with that? And she said, well, it's the accepted casualty to achieve herd immunity. And I said, okay, great. Please tell me how many children the CDC projects we will have die or, will essentially be murdered by this program, that could have gone on to be president of the United States, or maybe a scientist that could make a vaccine that doesn't kill anybody. I mean, we are essentially going to have innocent children die. And she said, and I said, so what is that number that the CDC projects? She's like, oh, we can't project that number because we don't have the data on that. And that's exactly the problem, right? And that's where people really get frustrated. But I've won 4 lawsuits against government health agencies based on these issues. I've won against Health and Human Services, the National Institute of Health, CDC, and the FDA, and mostly because they just won't give me the data I know they have. And as a citizen, I'm allowed to use a FOIA request and say, I'm simply looking for this data, and you're not providing it. We just won a lawsuit against the CDC based on autism itself. And here's what I asked them. We used Freedom of Information Act requests. This is a great thing in America. People should know about this. Anyone can do it. If you have a question of your government agencies and you think they might have an answer you want to know, you just simply write a FOIA request to the department you're looking to. In this case, we said to the CDC, when I go to your website on the CDC, in fact, let me just take it back a step. When I'm getting my child vaccinated at the pediatrician's office, I get a sheet called the VIS, the Vaccine Information Sheet. And it's really simple. I mean, it's like a golden book of science, right? It says there may be some swelling at the arm and some fussiness and crankiness and maybe a slight fever. Those are all normal reactions. And that's it. Oh, that's the only problem with vaccines. But then at the bottom it says, if you want more information, go to this, CDC website. Well, when you go to that website, the very first thing that pops up is a banner across the top of the website that says, vaccines do not cause autism. That's interesting. I wasn't asking about autism. I was just wondering, what are the possible side effects? And yet, this is what the CDC really wants me to know. So obviously, they're concerned about whatever stories are out there. And so we said, obviously Vaxxed, the film I made, is about a whistleblower at the CDC. He still works there, by the way. He's protected by whistleblower status. He provided 10,000 documents to support his claim that they committed scientific fraud. They manipulated a study as soon as they saw that it was showing that the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, could be causally linked and related to autism. It was a study that was supposed to take 6 months. Studies are supposed to be very transparent, come out to the world. Instead, they spent 4 years behind closed doors changing numbers, literally kicked half the kids off of the study to try and lower the numbers so that it looked better, and in the end came out and, as William Thompson, the whistleblower, said, we dragged a garbage can in the middle of the room and they made us destroy our hard drives and our files so that nobody could ever see what that study really showed. Now, that's what sort of brings me into this discussion is, that's the MMR. And the MMR is the one that's gotten a lot of the attention. But here's the thing, Mitch. As I travel the country with Vaxxed. You know, we had a bus that said Vaxxed on the side of it, and people were signing the names of their injured children and their own injuries. I think there's over maybe 8,000 signatures or more now. It's a traveling memorial. But more and more parents were coming up, and we were interviewing them about their own personal story. And I'll be honest with you, more often than not, someone would say, we never got to the MMR vaccine with our child. Our child regressed into autism right after the Dtap vaccine, which we get at 12 months and at 6 months. And I thought, wow, that's, okay, that's interesting. In fact, I would say more people claim Dtap caused their child's autism than MMR, which was MMR was the central point of the film that I had just made. And that's what set me on my journey to investigate it. So back to the CDC. Last year, at the beginning of the year, we asked the CDC to provide us with every study or whatever information they use to come to the conclusion that vaccines do not cause autism, and specifically for the first 6 months of life. The first 6 vaccines are given in multiple doses for the first 6 months of life. I recognize that the MMR has had several studies, and one of them very fraudulent that I'd made a movie about, but I'm more interested in the vaccines in the first 6 months of life because we're getting better and better at diagnosing autism. And they're starting to say we can diagnose it starting at 6 months old. So that means if vaccines, again, we're being reasonable. And I'm just asking reasonable questions. If you can diagnose autism at 6 months old, then it would stand to reason that if vaccines could be contributing to the issue, then that vaccines in the first 6 months of life should be looked at very closely. And so I just wanted to see what studies were done that showed that those vaccines don't cause autism. And that would be Dtap Vaccine, Hib, hepatitis B, the polio vaccine, Prevnar, and I think a couple of those are doubled up. There's a couple different versions. And so we laid that question out to the CDC. And they avoided us for a year. I mean, they're supposed to respond within 30 days. After about 60 days, we sort of used an executive action and said, look, we're kind of threatening you now. You got to give us your background. How are you saying? Because it doesn't say MMR doesn't cause autism. It does, you know, it says all vaccines. Okay, science has got to prove every statement it makes. So clearly you've done studies on these first 6 vaccines. Well, they kept pushing back, kept pushing back. After a year, we took them to court. And we sued, and we said to the judge, they're not answering our question. And so under a court order, they finally provided us with the 20 studies that they said answer our question, which is, what studies did you look at for the first 6 vaccines? And you know what it was? About 5 of them were MMR studies. Totally irrelevant. I didn't ask about the MMR. I asked about the ones I told you about. The other, about 9 or 10, were thimerosal, which is a mercury-containing preservative not found in any of the vaccines that we give in the first 6 months of life. The other handful were MMR thimerosal studies, like the 2 elements that don't have anything to say with what I asked about. And so out of the 20, there was 2 final studies that, you know, might be able to say they had any reference to the 6 vaccines we asked about. One of them was an antigen study that essentially, antigens is the viral material, the bacteria material in the vaccine. And the question was, does the more antigens or less antigens, you know, contribute to autism? So they compared groups of kids that got the older schedule where we used to use vaccines that had a lot more antigens in them, and now we use less antigens and more toxic chemicals. We use chemicals to make those antigens, you know, react with our body more. And what they found was both of they had the same amount of autism in both groups, essentially. And it even said, so you could say, well, what did you learn from that? I mean, you have more toxic chemicals here, but more antigens. It's a terrible, terrible study. And even they admit in the conclusion, this study cannot be used to disprove the association between vaccines and autism. We weren't looking at that. We were just looking at antigens. So we're left with one last study. There was one last study, the only one that actually mentioned one of the 6 vaccines we're asking about. And in this case, it was a study looking at the Dtap vaccine. And it wasn't actually a study. It was a paper that was written by the Institute of Medicine, our Nobel laureates, the most brilliant scientists we have that don't work for the government. And every once in a while, the CDC will task the Institute of Medicine with doing an investigation for them. And so they said, the CDC basically said, a lot of parents are claiming their child regressed into autism after the Dtap vaccine. Will you please investigate this claim and see if there is a causal relationship. And so this thing that was provided to us, the only one that mentioned one of the vaccines, the Dtap, when you read it, it ends up saying this, that after investigating it, the Institute of Medicine concluded we can neither confirm nor deny a causal relationship between the Dtap vaccine and autism, essentially because no studies have ever been done using autistic children who received the Dtap vaccine. So there was never a study, so of the 6 vaccines, essentially, the one study that mentioned one proved our point. You have never done anything, there's no science that you can point to that says that these first 6 vaccines, given in about 24 doses in the first 6 months of life, don't cause autism. There it is. And so when you hear Sanjay Gupta, on CNN, or you hear your pediatrician telling you thousands of studies have been done, mountains of studies have disproven this connection between vaccines and autism, I have news for you. My nonprofit just proved that at least for these first 6 vaccines, that is just categorically not true. We're not mountains. There was 20, and 18 of them were completely irrelevant, and the other 2 were a waste of time. They didn't address the problem. So essentially, there are 0 studies. When I asked, and people said, well, what about this study? What study? I was like, I don't care. I asked the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the people that make our vaccine schedule. I don't care whatever cockamamie study done in the middle of Peru or something that you want to point to. When I asked the CDC, who I'm supposed to trust, they basically essentially said, we don't have any studies. And so we're demanding now that they take that statement down off of the website. You can say, if you want, MMR doesn't cause autism. And I have a movie you should see about that called Vaxxed, which shows that the primary study you're referencing is actually a fraud. But okay, you could at least say we did science using the MMR looking at autism. But the rest of them, in fact, of the 16 vaccines we give our kids, 15 of them have never been in a study that had anything to do looking at can it cause autism. And so Sanjay Gupta is lying. Your pediatrician is not necessarily lying, they've been lied to. I don't know what you call it when you are just repeating a lie, but that's the state of vaccine science and autism in the world.
Man, I'm going to have to just absolutely agree with you on that. And again, I've got some other topics I want to hit you with.
All right.
But just bringing this up, and I want your opinion on this, because I have to think about it as, you know what, maybe there's too much in there that if revealed to the American public, it's catastrophic, right? So let me just propose this question. Just tell me what you think about this. What if we stopped today and we said, okay, vaccination companies, here's the deal. We're going to exonerate you from any wrongdoing, but as of today, we need the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. I mean, is that the solution to this problem?
Can I take it back a step before that? Because I think you sound like you probably have a pretty smart audience. And I think the question, people say, why would they lie, right? When we're right here, and I rarely get to talk about this, so because it popped into my head. And remind me of the question you just asked. But why would they lie, right? That's the question. Why would they do this? Why would they poison children? Why would there be this big cover-up? And I want you to think about what you just said. It would be catastrophic, wouldn't it, if they admitted it, or would it? And see, here's the problem. So I'm going to answer your question and while also talk about the issue. The number one problem is the manufacturers are already completely exonerated from any damages. And that's the number one problem we have. We exonerated them from any damage from their products back in 1986 when we passed the 1986 Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. This was essentially the pharmaceutical industry was blackmailing Ronald Reagan. And they said, we are losing money. We can't make money on vaccines because there are so many lawsuits for death and injury from vaccines that we cannot make a profit. I want you to wrap your head around that. I mean, we see $3 billion paid out for Vioxx and other drugs that had issues, and still they made a profit, right? So these products, vaccines, made those ones that get discontinued, and we see the big giant class action lawsuit. Vaccines were costing them more money than they could make. That's how bad the product was. But the United States government, for multiple reasons, and we could get really, I've looked at all parts of this, but imagine, The number one fear the CDC has is a biological weapon, right? Someone's going to make an Ebola bomb and drop it in the middle of America. And if we don't have vaccine makers with manufacturing plants like we're watching with coronavirus right now, right? We got to be able to ramp it up really quick and get a vaccine out really quick. That has always been the mentality. And knowing that that was their mentality, they said, okay, what choice do we have? We can't have drug companies have no facilities to make vaccines in case we ever get attacked. So they passed the 1986 Act, taking all liability away from the manufacturer. Where did the liability go? The liability went onto our own government, onto Health and Human Services. For people that don't know what these letters mean, Health and HHS is sort of the mothership of your health department. That's the top. HHS, underneath it are these umbrellas. You've got FDA, CDC, NIH, HRSA, all under Health and Human Services. Now, when you're injured by a vaccine, or you think your child's been injured by a vaccine, you have to sue not Merck, not Sanofi Aventis. They're totally free from liability. You actually sue. At this moment, you would be suing Alex Azar, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. That's who you're going to sue. And in order to win, you have got to prove that the vaccine, that there's science that shows that the vaccine causes the problem that you're suing for. Let's say autism, right? And Alex Azar is going to use Department of Justice lawyers against you. I mean, this is a kangaroo court like we've never seen. They're going to bring in Department of Justice lawyers, so government lawyers, the best there are. There's no judge, there's a special master, and there's no jury, and no press is allowed. And no precedents. You're not allowed to reference a case before yours because it's all done in secret. I'm not making this stuff up. I mean, there's nothing like this in the world. And so how are you going to prove that the vaccine caused the injury it's supposed to cause? You have got to get the science, a study, just like the Institute of Medicine just told you. There's no study that looked at Dtap and autism, so you got nothing to bring into that courtroom. You have nothing to bring in that courtroom, and that is the whole play, right? That's the plan. Health and Human Services is in the defense position. And guess who is supposed to have done the science you need in order to win this case? Health and Human Services. This is exactly like being in the middle of a murder case where the murderer is doing everyone's forensics. I mean, it's absolutely the most corrupt system there ever was. But here's the point. Why are we in this problem? I believe the government did not realize how bad vaccines really were. I think they thought, well, it's a trivial problem. We'll just have taxpayers pay for the injuries. And then all of a sudden, there was 5,000 cases overnight of autism in this vaccine court. Each case up until that moment was paying $3 to $5 million for the lifelong cost it is to, as you well know, to raise a child with autism is very, very expensive. Well, take $3 to $5 million on your calculator and multiply that by 5,000 and recognize that that was just the tip of the iceberg. And suddenly you had our government recognizing we could be bankrupted by this. So now what do? Do we admit it to the public? And then how many cases of autism are we going to pay out? Trillions of dollars? And you see, and so what they tell themselves is the injury is so rare and so small that it's an accepted casualty, but they won't do any science. Why? Here's their argument, and it's a decent argument. They are concerned that if they ever do a study that shows that vaccines can cause autism, some of the time, 5% of the time, 10%, let's say 1%, they think that the human psyche is designed in such a way that everyone will just stop vaccinating altogether. And you might be sitting at home going, well, that's a good point. You're right, it is a good point. There would be a concern that this vaccine program would just absolutely crumble to the ground by admitting that there's just a small group of children that are being injured. But now I want you to think that through. That is why no science is being done at all. And so all we're getting is a slogan that vaccine injury is rare. There is no science to back that up whatsoever. And they're refusing to do the science because they're so afraid if you knew whatever it was, it would bring the vaccine program to the ground. So now you've got to recognize that the manufacturer has no responsibility and your government is doing nothing to investigate the dangers and the millions of people that are increasing. We are now at 1 in 54, I think, children with autism. And you got to look at New Jersey that's tracking it better than anyone else. They're at 1 in 34. Okay, this is a pandemic. This is an epidemic of catastrophic proportions that no one wants to talk about. In fact, my show, The HighWire, this week, people need to go to thehighwire.com. We have a brand new whistleblower that's about to blow some stuff open on this. And I know you don't want to stick with autism, but it is the buzzword, right? And it really, I want people to recognize, what do I do if my government has a valid concern that doing science, even if it was an infinitesimal amount, could hurt the program, but we won't know if it's a large problem because they're not doing the science. And so that becomes the catch-22 all of our children are hanging in, right? We are hanging as we are now just a part of a giant human experiment. And let me just talk about that experiment very quickly. In the 1980s, when our children were only getting 11 vaccines by the time they were 18, the chronic illness rate of our children was 12.8%, meaning they either had a neurological disorder or an autoimmune disease. Those two columns sort of sit under chronic illness. 11 vaccines, 12.8% chronic illness. Now our children are receiving 54 vaccines in 72 doses. In most states, it's about where we're at and growing. But 54 vaccines, but remember, some of those vaccines have 4 different antigens, so 72 vaccines. And now our chronic illness rate in our children is 54%. More than 1 in 2 children has a chronic health condition they will suffer from the rest of their lives. That means that is the greatest decline in children's health in recorded medical history. We have never seen that happen. In the course of 30 years, half of our kids can't breathe the air anymore, can't drink the water, can't eat a peanut without potentially dying. That is what has that's where I'm the most concerned. And if those weren't the stats, I probably wouldn't be here. If we had the healthiest kids we'd ever seen, and they're just amazing and glowing, shining examples of health, what purpose would there be to talk about the potential injuries from vaccines? But we have the sickest generation of children we've ever seen, and we have the sickest nation of children in the industrialized world. We have more babies die on the first day of life than every other industrialized nation combined. We have more babies die in the first year of life than any other industrial nation in the world. And you are now, I think, 70% more likely to die before reaching the age of 18 if you live in America than if you grew up in the other top 20 richest nations in the world. That means America, for some reason, has a serious medical problem. And as an ex-producer of the medical talk show, The Doctors, I don't believe it's the doctors that are necessarily at fault. We have the best hospitals in the world. We have the best doctors in the world. There is something we are doing to our children that is making them catastrophically ill. And when I look at it, there is nothing that coterminously moves with the rate of that illness the way the increase of the vaccine program does. And the only way you're going to be able to disprove what I'm saying is you're going to have to start doing some science. So anyone out there yelling at their TVs right now saying, Del has no proof, whatever, I actually do. I have scientific studies that back up everything I'm saying. I can show you VAERS. I can show you all of this data. And in fact, there's a brand new study out by Brian Hooker, who's one of the scientists in Vaxxed. He did a comparative study between vaxxed versus unvaccinated children, found exactly what we thought. The unvaccinated have far less chronic illnesses and conditions. So you can say, well, that wasn't a big enough study, or maybe he had a bias. Great. Call the CDC and tell them, do the same study and prove Del wrong. Because Bobby Kennedy and I had that opportunity. We went for a meeting at the National Institute of Health, set up by Donald Trump right after Donald Trump had been elected. We brought 5 scientists that are doing the science we're looking at, and lawyers and doctors, and we sat across from Tony Fauci was right across the table from me. Francis Collins was right across from Bobby, who was sitting next to me. And the rest of the luminaries of our virology and immunology departments. And we said, why aren't you doing placebo studies with any of the childhood vaccines? How can you say they're safe if you're not using the gold standard of safety science, which is a placebo-based safety trial? They admitted we don't do them for any vaccines because it would be unethical. And we said, okay. And for people that don't understand that, they think vaccines are so great that to have a placebo group that's not receiving the vaccine would be unfair. I think that's ridiculous, and I could spend a whole 4 hours explaining why, but let's just take their word for it. So then we said, okay, fine. It would be unethical to do what's called a prospective study, meaning we're going to withhold vaccines from one group and give them to another. This group's going to get a saline injection. We're going to track them and see how they do. Well, then why don't you do a study that would be ethical? The CDC sits on a database called the VSD, the Vaccine Safety Data Link. Has over 10 million people, their entire lifetime of medical records. And without their names on it, so it's totally privatized. Oh, tens of thousands of people that are completely unvaccinated in that database. And we said, just do this. Just do a study, an epidemiology study, take all the vaccinated against all the unvaccinated and ask simple questions. Who has more cancer? Who has more ADD, ADHD? Who has more diabetes? Who has more autism? You know, and on, asthma, all of these things, peanut allergies that are plaguing our children. And you know what they said to us? We will never do that study. That's it. We will never do that study. So there you are. Now we can go anywhere with this conversation. I don't know where you go with that, right? As a guy who loves science, that worked on a scientific talk show, I was flabbergasted. Like Bobby Kennedy, you should have seen the look on his face. Like we rode away, like looking at each other and saying, now we went there expecting to get archived information from the annals of their basements or whatever, proving us wrong. And we literally said to each other, if we ever thought we were wrong before, that meeting with the top health officials of the United States of America erased any doubt we have that we are onto something. There is something really messed up going on here.
Well, you know, one of the things that I've recognized during this podcast, you were the easiest interview I've ever done because you went down my entire list without any pre-scripting of any sort. But, you know, one of the things I do want to talk about is, you know, again, logically speaking, I don't think it is just autism. I think there is a whole plethora of other health concerns that go along with that. The other thing that I look at too when I'm looking into you, and by the way, producer Chad's going to contact Dr. Fauci's going to contact Bill Gates himself. We're going to contact these people. We're going to give them a chance to come on this show as well and do their side. I think it's only fair, right? But boy, what I always look at is when I was doing my research into you, who you were and what it is. Number one, I look at passion because passion tells me something. That means somebody really wants to find the truth. The second thing is, did you do the work? And the work has been done. And so for me, it's not about bringing some people to vaccination or anti-vaccination. It's about developing the truth. What is really out there? What are we really doing? And damn it, these are our kids, man. This is the real deal. This is not a dress rehearsal. This is a one-time shot at this thing. And so that brings out the passion in me. I've been a doctor, as I've told you before. People ask me this question, you know, should I vaccinate? Should I not vaccinate? I always had the same thing. I believe it's your personal choice. I never want to make a decision for a person that if they didn't get the vaccination, they get the disease, or if they get the vaccination, they get one of these other horrible, horrific things. I believe that's their choice, which now is going to lead me into this segment of SB 163 right here in my home state of Colorado.
Yeah, and by the way, the state I grew up in for the body of my childhood from the time I was 7 until I went off to school, and so it's really hard. And my entire family lives in Colorado. I've been traveling there. We've been fighting a very similar law every time it comes up in Colorado. And when I was, I was living in California when obviously when I was working the doctors and when I started my show, the HighWire. But last year, I needed to move. It was clear California was going south. They were going to take everyone's rights away. And it was just getting worse and worse. And it felt like a military state. I went and looked at Colorado, and I actually was thinking with my family, maybe we'll move to Colorado. But as it got closer and closer, something started concerning me, which was just the makeup of the politics there. And I'm not political, but this does seem to go on party lines, as this vote did yesterday. SB 2163, in my understanding, down party lines. I believe the vote was 7-4 coming out of committee, 7 Democrats, 4 Republicans against it. And, there will be people that say this bill has no teeth, that all it really does is sort of reorganize things, create databases, and, but it's how all of this starts. I mean, you're beginning a path here. And so my understanding of this bill as it is right now is essentially they want to take away the terms religious and philosophical exemptions and make it a non-medical exemption. Which basically, I mean, if you think about it, what are they doing? They're naming it the moron exemption, right? I mean, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to give it a vernacular that just sounds uneducated. In fact, I keep pushing states to, I want to pass a scientific exemption. I don't forget religion and forget philosophical. I have a scientific problem with the vaccine program. I have a scientific problem that they've never done the gold standard placebo study. I have a scientific issue with there's no comparative study on the planet Earth done by anyone you trust. I can show you 2 or 3 done by independent scientists showing that vaccines make you sicker. So I have a scientific exemption. I have a scientific reason I don't want to vaccinate my children. That's where I think we should go. But essentially what this bill does is it takes away the religious and the philosophical and makes it a non-medical exemption. There's a reason for that. It also makes you want, now if you don't want to vaccinate, instead of just being able to sort of report directly to school, you got to get online, you get a specific form, and in order to get that form, you got to be read the Riot Act by somebody who absolutely believes in the religion of vaccines, and then you've got to be, they got to attempt to indoctrinate you for however long the video is going to be, and then you get that, then you can have the exemption. But by the way, that exemption now is going to go into a database where we can track you and your families and all of these things, which anybody who has any concept of freedom or liberty knows that that is a slippery slope to the end of anything that our founding fathers ever dreamt about. Can you imagine if we had reported where we all lived to the, to King George when we were trying to, maintain our freedom in America? That's essentially what they're asking you to do. We just need to know where you live and exactly what your belief system is. Are you with us? Or are you with them? And so that is a massive, massive problem. And by the way, it's exactly the playbook that California took and many of the other states. Here in California, it was AB 2109 that did the same thing. It wanted to create a database. Oh, you'll still have your exemption. You just have to hear from a doctor giving you the Riot Act. It won't lead, and everyone's like, this is going to lead to you removing the exemption. No, it won't. No, it won't. Senator Richard Pan was at the head of it. And then what happened? Very next, legislative cycle, what do? They took away the exemption with SB 277. It was game over. So Colorado is heading down that road, and it's going to be very difficult to stop because my understanding is they have a Democratic majority in both the Senate and the Assembly, and though this should not be a political issue at the moment, for some reason it is, and in some ways it's really scary. I know right now they are rallying at the Capitol in Denver as we speak because it's now in the Appropriations Committee, meaning is this going to cost us too much to track free citizens and make sure we know who they are, where they are? Oh, and by the way, when you start thinking of tracking and all the social distancing and all these things, folks, this was all written about in science fiction movies and in science fiction novels, and it's not a conspiracy anymore. It's not a theory anymore. They're trying to pass these things as laws.
And that leads me into another segment where I watched you you were in an interview with Alan Dershowitz, and yeah. Never in a million years did I think I would be on camera in front of millions of people talking, going against Alan Dershowitz. Now, I'm going to assume that his Harvard law degree is somewhat considerable more than mine, but and maybe I misunderstood it. I'd like for you to clarify a little bit of it, but it kind of, in paraphrase, was that he was going down the line of it's if you don't vaccinate and you were to happen to pass something along to someone who could not get vaccinated, that was some sort of a constitutionality issue or something he was talking about. But I would challenge that fact, Alan Dershowitz, which still blows me away I'm even saying this. But isn't it also the right for if you know or if you feel that vaccinations kill children, isn't that the same argument?
Well, I mean, first of all, that was probably a bucket list moment, as I'm sure you can imagine as someone that does a show, when you actually think, oh my God, I'm going to debate probably the world's leading trial attorney alive. It was quite a moment, and it took, I want to thank my team for preparing me for that. That's not something, I tend to wing it. I'm sitting here, I'm winging it with you. I did not wing that conversation with Alan Dershowitz. But what he had really said, it's a little bit on the other side of it. yes, you could argue that you're not allowed to put other children at risk, right? You're not allowed to pass on an illness. But what he had really said was that the government has the right to forcibly inject you. He said, as close to as accurate as I can say, they can drag you to a hospital and they can plunge a needle into your arm and there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, and I know what legal precedents he's referencing, and if he left it there, then it's just Alan Dershowitz, stating his legal knowledge. But he then later in the interview said, and I hope when we have a COVID-19 vaccine available that the government will enforce or create a law, a mandated law like that, and I would love to be the lawyer that defends that all the way to the Supreme Court. And in making that statement, he now attached his own personal opinion to the discussion, and that's why I had him on my show. It's one thing to state what you understand as the legal, precedents. It's another thing to say that you hope that that type of constitutional conflict comes into this country and you want to take another side of it. And so I debated him on that perspective. And just go to the HighWire.com. It's Dell versus Dershowitz. It's 30 minutes long, but that's the difference between what the HighWire does and any other television network. I wasn't trying to get a gotcha moment. I really wanted to show people what I believe a conversation on this can be with someone who is very well educated and has done his homework. He even said that in the interview. When I first spouted off that statement, I wasn't prepared, but now because it's gone viral, I've looked into this, I have a much stronger perspective. So when you watch my debate with him then, knowing this is now an educated Alan Dershowitz, you can recognize, and anybody that's pro-vaccine should watch it, anybody that's anti-vaccine, because what you'll see is what an educated debate on this topic sounds like and looks like, and you'll recognize how many blind spots are in the mirror of people that think that forcing vaccinations is okay and is protected by the Supreme Court. And in the end, everyone will have to admit, he smiled and he thanked me and said that was very educational. I learned something today, and we need to have more debates like this. I won't, give away the entire approach or what he sort of conceded, but I would say if you watch it, you'd have to agree with me. There's about 3 or 4 points I set out to make, and he conceded every one of those points and started his conversation saying, I believe I win this 9-0 in the Supreme Court, maybe 8-1. I think by the end of the conversation, he recognizes, oh, this would be a major fight. This would be a major fight, and he said the points you're making would definitely be points that could be very effective on the other side of this conversation.
No, I watched that entire interview, and I thought it was fantastic. I think that's what interviews should look like, right? 2 people having a discussion, debating differences, and then walking away with, hey, how can we make this better? Absolutely.
Right.
I'm going to go down a couple more things. One thing about the movie Vaxxed, I wanted to do this.
Okay.
And I did it this way. So I took 8 doctor friends of mine, 1 orthopedic surgeon, 1 neurosurgeon, 2 family practice docs, a chiropractor, and a plastic surgeon. Although we say he's not a real doctor, but he did go to medical school. And 2.
I want to correct that for a second, because I used to joke when I worked on the doctors. Dr. Drew Orden was our plastic surgeon. I just kind of would always, great guy, funny, tan, brilliant. And he was a boob doctor, right? I was like,
right.
He's a boob doctor. But I'll tell you what, we all went to Haiti right after the earthquake, and I watched him. He could do more than anyone there. Kid whose head had been bashed open. We're looking at his skull. He did a surgery on that kid's head using ether. I mean, he said, I'm the only one old enough that actually ever used this in college. So I just for the plastic surgeons out there, we just think of them as sort of cosmetic, but you'd be shocked how valuable they are when you have carnage and any sort of thing going on. So I just for your friend that's a plastic surgeon, you'd be shocked in a crisis. He'd actually be the one of all of those people you would want with you.
You have no idea how true of a statement that is, but I know he's going to watch this, and man, it just feels good digging on him every now and then. I had all these guys watch the movie, and then they all called me back, and I kind of took this thing, and here's what is fascinating to me, and I'm gonna make this reference to another thing a little bit later on here. Again, not too much further down the road here, but there was that recent study, in December 3rd, 2019, The WHO Global Vaccine Safety Summit video revealed those doctors and scientists having that discussion behind closed doors, okay? I watched all that kind of stuff. And literally one of the doctors said that, you know, most in medical school, they're lucky if they get a half a day on vaccinations. Right. So I discussed this with these guys, and here's what was absolutely fascinating, and producer Chad can sit here and absolutely validate this comment. One of them literally was in tears after he watched that show. And what struck me is all 8 of them were like, oh my goodness, yeah, you know what, that's something that we need to rethink. And that, in my opinion, is unbelievably wicked validation that, you know what, there's always 2 sides to every story, but that side that wants to absolutely definitively say that there is no harm or no cause by vaccinations, and that the very same people that went to the very same medical school say, wait a minute, there's validation here. To me, that says a ton.
You know, it's interesting. We didn't talk about what you were going to say here, and I was thinking to myself, I suppose he's going to tell me some of these guys had a real backlash towards the film, and I was thinking to myself, even though I've never had that experience, in the 1 year I toured the nation with the film, the only doctors that ever came up to me were in tears. Almost every, you know, I always remember one story in particular where a guy came up, you know, well-dressed, and was screaming at me that I am getting, this is the most dangerous thing in the world. You are getting people killed. People are going to die because of what you're doing. And I just said, I understand your perspective. Are you going to watch the film? He's like, yeah, I'm here to do my research so I can refute whatever it is you're saying in there. I said, I appreciate that, and that's what you should do. I said, will you please come up to me afterwards and just tell me, you know, what you think or what you think I should investigate? And I'll never forget that guy. I mean, he was angry. Like, he looked like he wanted to hit me. And when he came out, I mean, it was clear. I mean, swollen face, tears running down his face. And he walked up to me and said, I don't know how I'm going to atone for what I've done. I realize now that I really haven't been using my mind. I haven't been critically thinking or even listening to these parents that are complaining to me or are asking me important questions. And he said, I'm going to have to, he literally said, I have to get a therapist because I'm going to have to work through what this film has just brought out in me. And I thanked him, and he went on his way. And, you know, it's something that, as an artist or as a filmmaker or anything you do, Vaxxed is something special. It's not something that I can take credit for. I remember when we watched sort of the final edit, Andy and I and the editors and some of the producers were all sitting in a room. And when the credits rolled, I was in shock. And I remember just thinking, who made that film? I mean, it's not me. It cannot, no one in this room is talented enough to do what I feel like that film is going to do to people. And it really, but I still believe that doctors would refute it, or nurses. And the reaction from doctors who rarely watch it, right? They rarely will, they just won't do it. They protect themselves by not allowing themselves to even look at it. We've gotten reports from nurses where the entire staff of hospitals were gathered when that was traveling the country and said, you are not to watch Vaxxed. You are, you know, mandated essentially, if you work in this hospital, to not go and see Vaxxed. So, of course, there's about 5 nurses that were all there saying, they don't know we're here, but that just made us curious. But imagine just that thought alone, right? Wouldn't you, if you really believed in what you're doing and knew you had the truth, wouldn't you say everyone needs to go and see that film? Because you're going to need to be able to refute the insane, stupid things that are said in it, because you're going to have a lot of patients asking questions. That was not the approach. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know what's in that film that actually affects doctors the way it does. I did my best to make it make sense, to keep it interesting and have enough different, you know, reliable sources to validate each other in it. I don't know if it's the way Dr. William Thompson describes the fraud, that if you're a scientist, it really rings true. I don't know what it is. But that is the response, that I would say that doctors have a more visceral and powerful response from watching Vaxxed than your average person does. And it's really, something I say, you know, and back to the point, when I think of that film, it's sort of like a sculptor. They say, I didn't sculpt that, I just removed the stone that was in the way of that sculpture. I think Vaxxed is one of those things, and everyone should see it. I'm not saying it because I don't really have a connection to it. It is its own thing. It has its own life. It has its beauty. But if you have not seen Vaxxed, you really need to see what happens in that film, because it's an experience like nothing I think you will ever see in film.
You know, I appreciate you saying that, because, you know, I may be able to answer some of that. Mind you, these are good friends of mine. These are buddies of mine that, you know, we have a poker night or we go out, have dinner, wives, children. We know each other really intimately. And I can tell you this, collectively with all of them, the emotional draw to them was, and actually restored my faith in humanity and doctors. It was that these guys love to help people. That's what they got into it for. And I think it touched them in the feels that, man, I hope everything that I've learned is for the benefit of people. And it restored my faith in humanity of these guys. I mean, I love them all to death. I know they all care about every single person that they touch. But it's a feel-good moment. And I think that's where a lot of their emotion came from. So I'm pretty convinced with that. So I want to run through a couple more things here, because you've been so gracious in giving me your time. I can't even tell you how much I appreciate it. But there is that behind closed doors topic that those doctors and scientists were talking about. I mean, it's from the WHO, right? They're talking about safety issues, that they're not there. That rattles me to the core. CDC, they've been beat to hell lately, right? Of all kinds of different things. Even some of the research and studies you've done, that shakes my confidence. A lot of these things that shake my confidence are from the very people that are telling us this stuff is safe. Now, I don't know if I'm anti-vax. I don't know if I'm pro-vax. I don't even really know where I stand on it, to be 100% honest with you, because I kind of do my decisions based on my family, and I believe that's where I'm at. So I appreciate the work you went through. I know what it's like to run these types of things, and a guy who will do that much work is in the right place. So we got to touch on COVID, though. We have to. Yeah. Again, as I said, we're going to offer all these people to come on. We're going to call them out, and because I think that you have to have these discussions. I think it's kind of like political things, where I don't think you can have a Democrat interviewing a Democrat or a Republican interviewing a Republican. Right. I think you got to have the two sides to get to any truth in this. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but damn it, if you don't give me any information to go on, I mean, I got to go with logical thinking, and sometimes it sounds a little conspiracy theory to me. But people are going to label me however they want. I brought you on this show because I have listened to you before. You're 100% logical, which is the thing that blows me away. You back it up with science. I did my homework to make sure that everything you were saying is what it is. I did it. And man, I'm having a hard time disproving anything. And it leads me to that next category of, you know, where do we go from here? How do they establish that trust? What happens? So I kind of want you to wrap up a little bit about that, but we got to hit this COVID thing. I'm personally not taking the vaccination. I won't. I'm not going to inject it into my kids, my wife. I personally don't take the flu shot. Just a personal thing for me. But this is something that we've already established, that long-term diseases that are out there, we don't have some of the studies. The science isn't complete, right? I mean, and science has never settled anyway. The more we learn, the newer the science becomes, right? So it's never settled, at least in my opinion. But with this COVID-19, we go back to the Colorado bill of mandating vaccinations. Mm-hmm. I mean, this stuff just smells like a disaster to me.
Well, I mean, there's so much in that, and I think COVID-19 is given, and it's been really great for those of us that have been, and I almost was about to change the title to my show coming up Thursday because of what you said. We are watching the CDC flail. We're watching Tony Fauci and Deborah Birx and the NIH flail. In fact, you know, I want to tweet out right now, it just reminded me, I just want to ask, what has Anthony Fauci gotten right? I mean, I genuinely want to ask that question. To anyone out there in the world that say, I hate Trump and I love Fauci, will you please, I don't know why you're comparing a scientist to a president, but whatever the case may be, will you please tell me what Anthony Fauci has said I'll make it easy for you. All it has to have done is lasted in truth for 2 weeks. What has he said that held to be true for 2 whole weeks? That's how bad it is. I mean, these people are all over the map. From saying, he first said on 60 Minutes, masks are useless to a virus like this. There's no point in wearing one unless it makes you feel confident and somehow psychologically you need that, then go ahead. And then, now we know, everyone's saying you got to wear a mask. I mean, it goes on and on and on. The numbers, the Imperial College model, the 2 million people dying in America, you couldn't be further off the mark if you tried. I mean, it's not even like off by 50, it's like hundreds of times you missed this by, right? And so it does beg the question, if these are the people that told you that they've done the science that proves that vaccines are safe and they're the greatest invention and all the disease has been eradicated from it, why do you trust them? I mean, how do you trust them with COVID-19? You can't. And I've been, you know, when it comes to COVID-19, there's really only one point left. The CDC is now admitting at worst the death rate is 0.26%, 0.25%. We were told millions were going to die. Perhaps 120,000 might die. And honestly, everyone that has a working brain cell knows that those are the most bloated numbers you could ever have. We've never treated a disease like this where everyone that has it is going to be listed they died from it. We don't do that with the flu. When someone has a heart disease or they're having complications for chemo, and then all of a sudden they get the flu, we don't say they died of the flu. We say they died of the flu because they were dying from the chemo. Their body had shut down and it couldn't fight off the most basic illness, which is all COVID-19 is. It's a bad cold. And yes, if your body is shot because you have bad diabetes or bad heart conditions, it can be, you know, you are vulnerable. And I don't want to discount the threat to that 0.26%. But remember, 99.74% of the world have nothing to be concerned about with COVID-19. How is it we have destroyed the economies of the world and the United States of America when 99.74% of us have nothing to worry about? I mean, that is like mind manipulation control beyond anything you can possibly imagine. But because my focus is vaccines, and because I have been shouting from mountaintops since I got involved with Vaxxed, this isn't where I started. I didn't know what the connection between vaccines and autism was until I really started investigating it. I have won, as I said, lawsuits against government agencies. But when we look at the COVID-19 vaccine, it tells you everything you need to know. You don't have to go back and look at the body of research I have. You can go to our website, ICanDecide.org. That's my nonprofit. Go to white papers, and you will see all of our information on vaccines with hyperlinks. You just click on them to read the peer-reviewed science by top scientific establishments. I don't say anything that I cannot back up with peer-reviewed science. But you don't need to know any of that. Just watch this vaccine process because it's terrifying. Number one, we are putting 2 words together that are the most dangerous words ever put into one sentence. When you read any headline on the COVID-19 vaccine, what do they say? They are rushing the science. They're rushing the science to get a vaccine. Folks, you know, the beginning of any horrific science fiction movie starts with rushing science. In fact, some of the greatest mistakes we have ever made on this planet and humanity put those 2 words into one sentence. So right there, you really need a red flag to go off and go, whoa, 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 whoa. I don't like the idea of rushing science. Now, let's take it a step further. How are they rushing it, and what are they rushing? This isn't just a fourth approach at a whooping cough vaccine where we've done it before, we're just going to try something else. This is a brand new vaccine for an issue they have failed miserably at creating a vaccine for. For more than, I think, 20 years, certainly since early 2000s, since we had the SARS coronavirus, they have been attempting a coronavirus vaccine, okay? This isn't something that this year they said, oh, you know what, we better get on this. They have been on this, and they have failed and failed and failed and failed again, okay? Now, those failures weren't, oh, it didn't work. Every one of those failures it was deadly. This vaccine is one of the most dangerous vaccines that has ever been attempted in human history. Because when we went and investigated it, all of the animal trials, which is how you're supposed to start a vaccine process, all of the animal trials had the same result. 4 different drug companies we looked into, same result. They use ferrets. They give ferrets the coronavirus vaccine. And looked like the ferret was doing fine. They could have said the vaccine is safe, right? Oh, it's safe. Ferrets looked fine, didn't seem to get too sick. And then they checked their blood and found, oh, they're creating antibodies. Wow, the vaccine's working. It's amazing. We're there. They're jumping up. Probably, clinking champagne glasses. Only one last part of this study we got to do, and then we're home free. We can start selling this vaccine to billions of people. Well, that's called a challenge study, and it's the one part of the study you can't do with human beings. It's unethical. And why is it? Because with an animal, once you've given the vaccine, then you can hit them with the actual virus. And they put them in a cage and they sprayed them with coronavirus. And what they watched was a horror movie. The animals ended up, instead of the antibodies blocking and fighting off coronavirus, instead it seemed to attack their own immune system. Their own antibodies worked against them, and they started having respiratory failure, organ failure, catastrophic cytokine storms is how they describe it, where the immune system went so awry in the animals that it was terrifying. And it was so bad that in the end of several of these trials, when you read them, they put a giant warning. It says, caution. We should be very careful about moving forward with human trials based on our results. Those are the facts. That is what has actually happened. So now when you hear they're rushing the vaccine, they are skipping any further animal trials. And this issue that has come up with this vaccine is something you'll hear them touch on it because they have to admit it. Tony Fauci, you've heard him say, well, there's a chance this vaccine could make you more ill. So we don't want that to happen. And you've heard Dr. Peter Hotez, who has been working on his own coronavirus vaccine for decades. And he will say, we do have an issue with this because it could make you more sick. More sick meaning it could actually kill you. And think about what happened, right? The vaccine didn't kill you. It was actually coming in contact with the virus after you had it that then it became a deadly moment. We have experience with this. It's happened 2 other times that I know of. There was a dengue vax. Dengue vax was a dengue vaccine that they used in the Philippines. I think this was just over a year ago. You can look it up. And Philippines actually kicked the drug company out. They fired the health minister. Why? Because they gave this vaccine to children, and 100 of them died, not when they got the vaccine, when they came in contact with the dengue again. Their bodies overreacted and it killed them. And they realized the vaccine was doing the opposite of what it should do. Prior to that, there was an Rsv vaccine that was attempted for children, where they did a trial in children, and the same thing. It looked like it was a great vaccine until they came in contact naturally with RSV, and the kids started getting deathly ill. 2 of them died, and they stopped the program altogether. That is your coronavirus, folks. That is what is happening, and that is what they're rushing. They are rushing a vaccine that has the potential to kill people. And we don't know how many. We know every animal trial. Not some of them, every animal trial I could find, and maybe someone could correct me, and I'd be willing to say, okay, maybe there's a 5th or 6th one I didn't see. But so far, all the animal trials I've been able to find had this issue. And so when we think about what they're saying, they're skipping placebo groups. Right now, the Moderna vaccine that Tony Fauci's own NIH owns patents in. A conflict of interest, I don't know how you get around it or how we're accepting government agencies having patents on what could be a multi-$100 billion product. All right, but that's besides the point. Why don't they have a saline placebo group? Why aren't they comparing those that are getting it by injecting some people with a saline so that we have a comparative safety group? This is something we've been demanding from every childhood vaccine that's never been through. And by the way, I just submitted this demand to the FDA in a formal document that they, the way our government works, they have to consider it. We're demanding that the FDA not approve any coronavirus vaccine that was not tested against a saline placebo group. In both the 2nd and 3rd stage trials, we're demanding that any 2nd or 3rd stage trials started without a saline placebo, they have to start over and get a saline placebo in there. Just because though you and I will probably never take it no matter what, I'm still trying to make this product as safe for those that really want to believe in that process as they can. Well, let's think about what could happen, okay? This is theoretical. I'm not sitting here trying to scare you to death. I'm just telling you what is scientifically has a theoretical potential. You have a vaccine that made the animals look like they were safe until they come in contact with the illness. Then when they actually got in contact with the virus, they died. So what happens if we make the COVID-19 vaccine? And as Bill Gates says, they're literally, get this, they're ramping up production of billions of these vaccines, hundreds of millions in America and in the UK before they've even got through the safety trial. They failed for 20 years, but they're confident right now that one of these 8 is going to nail it, and they're already producing it. I mean, that's not how science should be done. But let's just imagine everyone on the planet, which is the dream of Tony Fauci and the dream of Bill Gates, 7.5 billion people get a vaccine, and it looks like it's safe. Let's take it a step further. I'm going to assume they did some sort of trial to hit animals with the virus to make sure they're not having that antibody immune enhancement problem. But they're only looking at one version of the virus. That's the only thing they can do in a study. We already know this virus, coronavirus, has mutated 30 times. There are 30 different mutations of it. So even if they say we solved our problem, which they'll admit to you they don't know why it happens, they don't know why the antibodies sometimes create this overreaction. They don't know what's doing it. But let's say in the trials they don't see it. And these are going to be small trials, right? Right now it's 45 people. Maybe they end up going to trials of 1,000 or 10,000, still not millions. But okay, let's say it looks like it's free and clear and it's fine, and everybody gets the vaccine. It is theoretically plausible that all they did was make a vaccine for the strain of the virus that they had in their lab. But now there's 30 mutations and a new one comes along that for most people, again, is a common cold, would have had a death rate of 0.26% again or maybe less. But because you have this vaccine, it now hits you and people start dying, just the way the ferrets did. They start having upper respiratory shutdown, organ failure, their brains start swelling. Only now it's not 0.26% that are dying. What if it's 1%? What if it's 5%? What if it's 20%? What if it's 60%? Do you realize that we have lived on this planet, and from the moment we were born on this planet as human beings, there has never been a virus or a bacteria that wiped our species out. We have only thrived. We have only grown. We have never been reduced in a size that actually mattered. But if we all get a vaccine that didn't look in its rearview mirror and see that blind spot, and now made us vulnerable, and there's no way to get that vaccine out of your body once it's in there. And now you start watching your neighbors dropping dead, and people are dropping dead all over. You see, rushed science, in my mind, is the only way you could actually eradicate our species. Because so far, in all the history of humanity, since the time we were cavemen, if that's what you know, wherever you come from and that's your belief system, then we have never been eradicated. But rushed science, that is the most dangerous thing that could happen. And that's why I want people to take this opportunity for the first time, if it's only the first time, to really ask yourself, is this something worth rushing? If, in one hand, the disease itself has a death rate of 0.26%, but you're looking at a vaccine that has failed in all of its animal trials and has a far higher death rate, could potentially wipe us out, wouldn't you rather they take a lot more time? That's what we're asking for.
I thank you for saying that, because that was kind of the last topic I wanted to bring up. By the way, I'm fairly certain you just convinced me for sure I'm not getting that. That was a pretty good synopsis there. The one thing that I think is being left out and it's not being talked about, because we don't have a vaccination, and Fauci actually said it himself on camera. I actually validated it. I went to it. Was saying that he hopes we don't have herd immunity prior to the vaccination coming out. That was an actual quote. I can't say it's 100% actual because I'm paraphrasing that. But we have somehow forgotten that the human body, as you just said, we are assuming that man knows better than nature, and that's just something that doesn't get talked about, and it makes me wonder if we don't have a vaccination for coronavirus for quite some time, what if we are immune to it just from just nature itself?
That's actually a topic I'm going to cover on my show this week. There's a good chance that we are going to hit herd immunity and that the number is far lower than we would normally expect. When we talk about measles, we hear that the vaccine has to vaccinate 95% of the population. The truth is when people actually got measles, herd immunity was considered to be at about 62% or so, less than 70%, because when you have the illness, you have lifelong immunity. When you get vaccinated, you have a few years of immunity, so you really can't create that, that army of protection that the pharmaceutical industry claims using a vaccination. But herd immunity is all that we've ever. That's why I can say we've always survived, right? There's always been people that are extremely susceptible, that are in a place in their lives that this mild illness is going to affect them. And we should be concerned about them and try to figure out ways to protect them. But I don't believe the way you protect them is by destroying the other 99.74% of people's lives. That has never made sense to me. I don't understand that thinking. I think a 3-year-old is smarter than that. But whatever, that's how they seem to want to go about it. But what's really fascinating right now, and some of the science we're going to discuss, is that multiple studies now around the world are looking at the fact that they actually believe that there's already an immunity in the population to COVID-19, and it's vast and profound. Part of the reason is that antibodies, which is what most people think of when they think of immunity, that's what they think is our immunity, that we created antibodies. But the truth is, and specifically with coronavirus, there's 2 functions. There's cellular immunity, there's your T-cell immunity, and then your antibody production immunity. Well, more and more science is looking at the T-cell response now to the coronavirus, and it appears that that is the more effective way that people are fighting this off. And if you think of, I guess the easiest way it's been described to me, and remember, I'm a reporter, I'm not a scientist, so some of this, I keep meeting with scientists like explain that to me. But my understanding is that essentially if you think of like you've got a walled-in city. Well, outside the city, you have a bunch of soldiers should you be attacked to make sure that they never even get to the wall. Those are your T cells. Your T cells go out and fight right away, and they'll fight anything they see. They don't care. They're just indiscriminate. They don't have to have a recognition of you. They just wipe it out. And then anything that gets through and the door gets open, then they shout in there. The T cells basically say, hey, mount up. You got to mount up attack. They're getting through the wall. And then inside the wall of the cell, your antibodies then start mounting a defense. They recognize the enemy, and they create a defense against it. So there's like 2 systems. Well, the T cell is appearing to be so profoundly effective that there are people that may never even really have any symptoms. We keep hearing about the asymptomatic carriers, right? They never went through the illness that comes with having to create antibodies or what you're feeling going on in your body because your T cells were so effective. Additionally, there seems to be a cross immunity with other coronaviruses, meaning a lot of people that back in 2018 had the common cold, which is a coronavirus, developed an immunity. And their bodies developed this really brilliant, strong immunity that is taking on and seeing the COVID-19 as just a coronavirus, and it's beating it. It already is immune to COVID-19. And the numbers are quite staggering. There are really top scientists saying it could be as high as 80% of us already have immunity to COVID-19 simply because of the common cold we got in the last 2 or 3 years. Which means that herd immunity, when we would normally have to have 60 or 70 or maybe 80% of people infected, it really may only need to be some part of the 20% of us that just didn't develop immunity to it last year when we had the common cold. So all of this there's so much that's changing on, and I'm obviously you can tell I geek out on this stuff. I'm really passionate and fascinated by the virus and how it works. And to be, just before we close, I want to be honest because you said something I agree with. The idea of a vaccine is a great idea. I think the principle of being able to inject some tiny particle of an illness into you and having your body mount a defense without actually going through, and illness and achieving all of the benefits that having a virus have, but without going through it, that's a great idea. The problem is they've never done it without hurting people. And we're recognizing more and more that our children are really getting as sick as they are because their immune systems aren't developed. It's like people that never lifted weights or never worked labor. I don't know if you remember the movie Wall-E, where everybody's just sort of sitting in a chair and they can't even stand because they have no ability, no muscle content. That's really what's happening in the immune systems of our children. Because we're vaccinating, we're not, what they call it, priming their immune system. We're not actually forcing their immune system to ramp up and fight and exercise, and so it doesn't work. And there's scientists that would say they're pro-vaccine. I can think of one in the UK, a knighted scientist. I don't remember his name. I just remember reading the article, and it was fascinating when I read it. He said, we know that because children no longer get childhood infections, that it's causing a rise in childhood leukemia. This is his words, not mine. This was the article. He said, therefore, I'm working on creating a yogurt that somehow can stimulate the immune system to make it think it's had a childhood infection so that it can start mounting a defense against childhood leukemia because it's not currently doing that. Well, what did he just tell you? What he said is because of the way we're raising our kids, they're not getting childhood infections. What does that mean? It's the vaccinations. It actually has now shown us that though getting, some chicken pox or being uncomfortable for a few days was not fun, that we now know in gigantic studies, if you had measles as a child, those who had measles as a child don't get the same cancers that people that didn't. If you don't get measles as a child, you have a 67% increased risk of developing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is a gigantic study that they looked at across the country. You have a 233% increased risk of developing Hodgkin's lymphoma if you didn't have natural measles as a child. Women who have measles and mumps as young girls reduce their rate of ovarian cancer by 50%. Okay? And heart disease, when people have measles and mumps, not the vaccine, but wild as a child, heart disease is reduced at a minimum of 10%, if not higher, depending on the studies you look at. But even at 10%, 650,000 people die every year of heart disease in America. If you took 10% of that, you just saved 65,000 people. So when they tell you that they're saving more lives than they're hurting, the numbers don't add up. If you take all the cancer that's being caused because you got vaccinated, all the heart disease, all of these issues, and God knows what we haven't studied, that your body was so perfectly, remember, we are virus. We are bacteria. Our bodies right now, inside of your gut, are millions and millions of bacteria and viruses that make up who you are. If all of those viruses and bacteria die, you die. You're done. You have millions of bacteria and viruses on your hands. You have MRSA right now. You have strep. You have all of these deadly things on your hands, but because you have all of the other viruses, they're fighting each other, and your viruses are winning the war. When you start using antibacterials, when you start vaccinating, when you start taking antibiotics, you are destroying an army, the true army of health, which is your gut and your natural flora, your natural viruses and bacteria. So you're right. Our war against nature, Tony Fauci's and Bill Gates' war against nature, in a way we've never seen it before, literally trying to stop herd immunity from happening, that I think is the most dangerous mindset there could possibly be. And amazing that they're failing so bad at selling us on it that they are buying politicians to force us into it. And that's where people need to wake up. That's the work we're doing now in Colorado. You see the problem. You've been voting for people that believe in this crazy mindset that some human being can target, kill certain viruses and bacteria in your body, and somehow that makes you healthier, even though they cannot provide a single study that proves that, and there are plenty that prove the opposite. You got to vote better. You got to get smarter. And I argue with my family in Colorado right now. I'm an environmentalist. I get it. I grew up a progressive liberal. Bobby Kennedy and I are doing everything we can to get the party we grew up in to recognize that vaccine injury is real, that injecting these chemicals and bacteria and viruses into your babies may not be as good an idea as it sounds. Well, it doesn't sound very good, does it? I mean, I'm always amazed. I remember seeing a meme that just said, you know what? Injecting bacteria, live viruses, and toxic chemicals into your children is dumber than it sounds.
The thing I'll end with here is, if you've ever seen something and you're saying, man, you know what, I'm dumber for watching that. Well, this interview here, I am smarter for watching it. And I thank you for your fight. There has to be this voice. There has to be. This unequivocally has to have this voice in the world we live in today. So I appreciate that. I'm going to invite these people. We're going to give them their say. Man, I would actually love to do a show, both sides, three of us sitting in there. I would just introduce you both, and I'd sit back there and let the rocking chair rock.
Yeah.
Again, I thank you so much for coming on Truth Talks. If there's anything we can do for you guys to help spread the message, anything you need, you let us know. We're happy to do so, and I just can't thank you enough for doing the show.
All right, I really appreciate it. Everybody should check out the HighWire.com, where you can check it on Facebook, the HighWire with Del Bigtree. By the way, I know that, I and Bobby Kennedy and those of us that are in this fight, we will sit down any day, any time. We will skip a wedding. We will skip whatever we had planned to sit across from Tony Fauci on a camera and have a moderator ask the most difficult questions they can come up with. That is a debate we are not only up for, we are praying for, we've been demanding. There's only one side not showing up. And given that I grew up playing sports and I watched my kid playing baseball, I've never seen a team win by forfeiting the competition. It is time for the other side to show up. And when they don't, you need to ask yourself why. Thank you so much, Mitch, for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Del. Hey, will you buy me a steak dinner if I can make that happen?
Absolutely. Steak dinner, all you can eat.
Hey, buddy, I appreciate you. We're done. I think this segment was awesome. I mean, you're always great, period. You're just always great.
Thank you.
Anything you need from me, you always shout, and I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart.
Will do. Take care.
All right, buddy.